can't start this conversation without talking a little bit about where media was, where media is today, and then we'll sort of like evolve into where media is going. And media, the topic of media right now is, there's really two parties. There's the media, and then there's the public that's reading it. So if there are any accolades to be bestowed or criticisms, it's to both, not just to one party. But I'm going to start with Gary Louie, and to talk a little bit about, what media was, what it is today, and kind of like just to sort of set the groundwork of what we're dealing with.
Okay. So if you actually wanted to have that conversation, this would be a 2-hour preface, because the media universe has not only changed, but by the time we leave here this afternoon, it will have changed again. It used to be, in my line of work, if you got your client on the front page of the Metro section of the New York Times, you were good for at least 2 months. You were golden. Now there is no front page of the Metro section of the New York Times. In fact, you could argue there is no Metro section of the New York Times. It is a reflection of the fact that the business model for media has disappeared, and what you knew is not coming back. The statistic I want to quote, which will probably make Winselberg wince because he knows it really well, and that is, I think 1/4 of the major newspapers in the United States have laid off people. In some media markets like Westchester, northern New Jersey, really solid demographic, you have no newspapers, right? You are seeing a diminution of viewership on TV news. The only time it spikes is when you have a hurricane coming ashore, and people turn to that still, it's urgent. If you walk into any newsroom these days that is fully functioning, you will see an electronic tote board. It is a running report to every journalist in the room as to what people online are looking at on their respective website. Now, I asked an editor at Newsday the other day, do you decide what you're covering based on what people are reading on your website? And they said, no, it's for guidance. But there are other news operations, and more often than not, broadcast news, where that is what's driving the coverage. So on WINS, and I know Ben Mevrak, the news director, really well, so if he were here, we would have that conversation, but a station like WINS will report the last triple shooting in the Bronx before it will report a major economic story on Long Island, by the very nature of how their digital analytics are driving who's listening to what. So that is in part what we're all dealing with here. And the last observation I would make on this is that when you have the Newsday owner, Pat Dolan, say, I'm no longer a newspaper company, but I'm a communications company, that tells you what you need to know as far as a visionary who is going to make sure that his company is sustained in this market for another generation. He has shifted the focus. He had to. Were he not to do that, he would be riding herd on a dinosaur. So that's our universe. And by the way, everybody up here has agreed, we're not talking about fake news, we're talking about news survival. Big difference.
Yeah. So I remember the old days, we used to get up Sunday morning, go to the porch, get the New York Times or Newsday, with the bagel and coffee, go through it, read it for an hour or so, and you just trusted everything that was in there.
Whoa, we're into fake news.
So, hold it.
Did we just make a turn?
No, fast forward till now, where we're conditioned, a lot of us, to trust. So I'm not saying I don't trust Newsday or New York Times, but I'm seeing other stuff in writing, whether it's Facebook or it's the micro news that gets flashed up. So we're sort of conditioned to be believing things that are happening that are being transmitted to us in writing. We're learning, and I'm learning now that they're trusted sources. And staying on to the real estate end, you go into it knowing that there's different parties. But Dave, talk to us a little bit about trusted sources, and even if you you know, and again, we're going to end up in social media anyway, but even trusted sources in print, because here on Long Island, really, it's not the major papers that are affecting local land use, other than the debacle we had in Long Island City with that technology company for 25,000 jobs. But out here, it's the local papers, you know, patches around, and there's different aspects of that. Just kind of talk, just sort of summarize before we start moving forward. We're going to try to end up with best practices going forward for everybody as consumers and readers, and then as the developers going forward as well.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Sorry. Just summarize what you deem to be trusted sources. So what's your rule book for us so that we can say, I'm reading here, I can trust what it is, I'm reading here, I shouldn't necessarily.
So just by a show of hands, how many people here think that the 20 kindergarten kids in Connecticut were actors and didn't really get their brains blown out? Show of hands? Okay, so that's a news source that puts out that news. Is it a trusted news source? I don't know. Some people believe it. Some people believe that the US government took down the World Trade Center and not the terrorists. Some people believe that we never landed on the moon. They thought it was all done in a TV studio, which, by the way, it was recreated in a TV studio at Grumman, but that wasn't the actual moon landing. So my point here is, there's news coming at you from all different places these days. Just because each staff is shrinking doesn't mean there's way more outlets where you can get news. Because of social media and things like Facebook and digital news, everybody's a publisher. Everybody is a news source. A trusted news source is a news source that is accurate 99.9% of the time, and something that you've been following for a while. I'm not saying that a new news source can't be accurate, but a trusted news source is a news source that's been established, that has a very, very good track record of being accurate. That's a trusted news source. And that's where most people get their news. And I'm not saying you should just get your news from one source. That's also a mistake. You should probably get your news from a number of sources because it gives you a broader perspective of what's going on.
Why news or information? So maybe we'll differentiate between news and opinion, or news and, what's the other word? Is it information? You know, news, we're saying, if it's a journalist, they're trained, they have, you know.
Are you asking the difference between hard news and opinion? Hard news and editorial?
Yes.
Well, usually my opinion is based on fact.
Mm-hmm. All right, so news is fact.
Your facts.
My facts. Well, they're my facts.
So news is fact. Okay, well, that's important to get it established. So even if you're reading a paper, if you're reading the editorial that's written by a journalist, it's fact. If you're reading an opinion piece in that same paper, it's not necessarily fact, right? But it's in the same paper.
I'm going to ask Wenzelberg a different question. If you think you've been burned by somebody and you're going to now report on a story, do you add any additional flavor to your story? Not that I'm suggesting the facts are off, you wouldn't do that, but you're going to return the favor somehow in the third graph because you got burned by somebody who led you down a path that was deliberately false.
I don't know why you would think that.
This is getting better than I thought it was going to be.
I don't know why you would think I would compromise my integrity just to get back at somebody. Of course I would. One of the things that, you know, we get news from so many places, and maybe what we should be talking about is news literacy, and I spoke to Dave about this. News literacy should be a mandatory course starting with middle school, at least starting with middle school and up. There's so many people in the public, news consumers, that don't understand how to consume news, and it's very, very important to do that. We get news from all different places. The news just comes at us. I get press releases. I get all kinds of news. And the reporter is the gatekeeper. We call it the gatekeeper. We decide what we think is news. And that's a very big deal. It's not only how you write a news piece. It's what you see, what you end up seeing. There's a lot of stories you won't see because they don't make the newspaper or they don't make a website. So we're the gatekeeper. After us is the editor. He's the next gatekeeper. So if he doesn't think the story we came up with is a valid story, doesn't want to put it in his publication, it doesn't make it in the publication. The third gatekeeper, who shouldn't be a gatekeeper, is the publisher. Sometimes publishers make decisions And, you know, maybe, as Gary said, maybe they want to get back at somebody, maybe they want to please an advertiser. I'll give you a really quick anecdote if we have time.
Sure.
There was a story a couple of years ago, and I'm not saying this to knock the newspaper, and I will mention the newspaper, but please, I'm not doing it today. I'm just going to give an example. Richard Brown, who was the DA in Queens, did a story about these people who worked for a very famous electronics firm, PC Richard. They arrested 5 people at PC Richard for using fake credit cards and sending high-end electronics to Pakistan to be used as bomb detonators or whatever they do with those electronics. The story was a pretty big story. We wrote about it because PC Richard is a big presence here on Long Island. Newsday didn't write about it right away. So it took a couple of days. I called Newsday. And just out of curiosity, I said, you know, I haven't seen this story in Newsday. Oh, yes, we will have it on Sunday. Well, on Sunday, on page 34, in the gutter, in the briefs, a little narrow section of briefs, right in the center where the best place is to bury a story, there's one paragraph on the story. Now, why do you think that is? Because PC Richards is probably one of their biggest advertisers. Now, I'm not saying, you know, this doesn't happen with a lot of publications. It does. So when you're trying to figure out how news gets to be news, there's a lot of considerations going on. Now, it's not that it was biased, it's just that it was buried.
So tying this back into what happens in real estate, because anytime a project tries to move forward, you know, of any size, immediately there's social media, Facebook, local papers are having opinions on what's happening. And people tend to be very lazy, including myself. You look at the headline and you don't really want to read the whole article. So whatever the headline says is what you think is happening. And people tend to, it must be coded in our DNA, we sort of repeat, have conversations. And being in real estate, I've gotten to be very fact-oriented. And I want to talk about bringing it to Huntington Station with Brandon, is talk about what you walked into with the school closing, you had the Avalon project, and then what they did with Renaissance Downtown is they came up with a whole different spin that's very significant. So why don't you talk about that?
Sure, and I'll even back up a little further because I think it'll give good context. I got involved in real estate about 15 or so years ago on a project where the first residents are moving in next month, I think. That's a success on Long Island. That was at the time the Glen Isle project, which RSR took over, and is Garvey's Point. Right. So we're talking the 2005, really 2006 or so. Facebook hadn't become a thing, at least not in the common vernacular and and we walked in and we sort of did it the old way because we knew that there was community resistance. And long story short, we had a whole bunch of meetings, actually met Gary through that and learned quite a bit then, tried to learn since. And what we realized is we got about a 75% negative to about a third were for, a third were against, and a third were kind of neutral. That's a huge win. And this is, again, pre-social media. But you still ended up going to the hearing expecting to get your legs cut out and knowing that there's going to be someone taking something you haven't heard that's going to set you back. So we thought, well, how do we change this as a developer that's doing large projects? And when you do a transformational project, the fears are understandable. You're going to change the dynamic of that community, hopefully for the better, but possibly for the worse. And you've seen developments that have not gone right, and that impacts a community for generations. So we realized we could do the typical dance. And the typical dance is, I know I need 500 units, to make this project work and, call it a build of $250 million. So when you walk into the community and to the municipality, it's a negotiation. And a negotiation is never honest or earnest. I don't come into you, Dave, and I say, look, I need to be at 5, let's start at 5. I ask for 10. So you ask for 1,000 units and $1 billion, and then you get chopped down and you hope you end up through this dance that's set up for failure, but hopefully it's a failure you can live with. Right. And we realized that's not going to work. So we came on the heels of Avalon, who's done tremendous work But they were the ones that took the arrows. It's always the pioneers that take the arrows in the back. And they dealt with too much traffic. It's going to overburden the schools. It's going to destroy the fabric of our community. And this was in a struggling area, a community.
Going to blow up the sewer system.
Blow up the sewer system, amongst other things. And it was, the level of vitriol was unlike most had ever seen.
Yeah.
Facebook had become a thing by now.
Right.
And we came in on those heels, and we didn't have the success that Avalon proved to be. So we didn't have that data. So what we developed was a program called crowdsourced placemaking. Long story short, it combined what we did in Glen Cove in the old grassroots, roll up your sleeves, meetings, and provide a social aspect. But it also combined social media and social networking. And it's the networking that ties into the media. The networking is, we're going to have a meetup once a month, and we're going to break bread. We'll have 5 minutes, 10 minutes discussion about a project update. We'll have a 30-minute, almost mini charrette to get ideas of what the community, from an outcome perspective, wants to see. And then we're going to just sort of talk about life. And through that process, outcome-oriented, what would you like to see Huntington Station become? Let's not work about the fears now, let's talk about overcoming them. All of a sudden you start to get, and almost every community is the same with different levers. I want places for my kids to live, attainably priced housing, job creation, more safe, walkable community, all of these things. And a long story short, is the only way to get the very outcomes that a community says they want is to provide them with what at first they are afraid of. Apartments in the appropriate places in a downtown, a mix of uses, more walkability, more, the evil word density, which by the way is activity. So to not take a 2-hour discussion and really put it down to 3-4 minutes now, we had this ongoing campaign that was inclusionary, that was socially minded and outcome oriented. From that, we worked backward to say, you don't have to have a project here, but if you want to have these 10 outcomes, then you have to do A, B, and C. Now it's up to the community to say, is that something we embrace? And suddenly, those who were adamantly against apartments say, I don't love the idea, but I understand it. And some people who are in the middle became true champions.
Mm-hmm. So another benefit of this is there's no developer, there's no building proposed, so people aren't as riled up as they would be.
Yeah, we call that process before plan.
Right.
When you're a developer, as I said before, the dance is not only you present a plan, but you have to present a plan that is so out of whack because you know it's going to get chipped down. We're not starting with a development vision, community. We are starting with a process. We're going to work and co-create a development vision. People in the room are probably familiar with the term P3, public-private partnership. Mm-hmm. You have to add the C. It's P3 plus community. You bring all of those together. The community understands that for anything to be built and for it not to be the status quo, and these aren't great status quos, or they wouldn't look for redevelopment, that you have to have some activity happen, and it has to be market-based.
Right.
And that understanding of matching the market to the community's desired outcomes, to the municipality who becomes literally the governing agent in all of this, that's how you get this co-creative plan before process before plan, where you don't put up your vision, get attacked, and hope in 2 years maybe you have half of that to build.
Right. All right, Chris, so we heard from Brandon that does third-party work. Mm-hmm. So you are the whole shebang within TriTech.
Well, we actually do put up the plan. And we do put up a plan that we can actually build. But we try to convince people that we're an organization that works with integrity. So one of the things that we do in our initial presentations is a series of slides that say what we said we were going to do and what we did. So we'll show you projects that what the renderings look like, what they look like at the end of the day, and they are exactly the same. We come into the town with something that will work for them. So in the beginning part of our planning process, we meet with everybody who wants to meet with us. So we go to any community organization, the historical society and the fire department and the school board and everybody, and we try to get their input, and see what it is that will, check off a lot of the boxes that Brandon mentioned. And then we put the project together around that input. And then we say, look, this is the project that your leadership and your community has come back to us with, and this is something that we can make financially. It's a sustainable project for your community, and we try to build a coalition inside of that community, and we do it from the beginning to the end. We continually go. We go into the restaurants. We go to the Chamber of Commerce meetings, and we create relationships and champions that way, and then get the project approved and built.
How much social media tracking do you do?
A ton. But at the same time, I think you mentioned people don't read the articles anymore. So a lot of times it's just the headline. So and if you if you read the comments on social media about that headline and read the article, the comments do not reflect most anything that's written in the article. And a lot of papers have paywalls. So even if they wanted to, they just get the headline, and when they click on it, they go through a paywall, and they can't read the article anyway. So they're not really as informed. The headline sort of dictates the conversation.
Have you noticed that Newsday has, well, let's talk about that for a moment. Have you noticed that Newsday does not allow a whole lot of comments on their articles, in part because of the level of vitriol and venom that they had been seeing previously?
Well, they do actually, when you see some articles have quite a bit of comments on them. So there was one recently, I think it was a story about the opening headline was that, I guess, high-priced apartments are driving people off of Long Island. Right. But if you read the article, that wasn't what the article was saying. They were saying, we need more development, you know? But you read the 300 plus comments that I waded through, and you will see that 250 of those people didn't read the article.
Yeah, that's part of the issue.
Yeah, and if I can jump in quick, I know one thing we want to provide are takeaways and best practices, and I think what you see here are two different approaches. There's not one way to do this, but there are some underlying themes, and I think a couple, and let me know if you disagree. One is being open, upfront, and honest, is being inclusive and immersing yourself in that community. You know, and whether you do that where your strategy is to provide what you're going to build, stick to it, and now you've built a tremendous track record of doing that, you know, or going by another type of route. There are others in the room. I know I saw Eric Alexander and the work that they do with the communities. There are a lot of different ways to do it, but they have these underlying factors that I think are important.
Right.
And being as open and honest and facing those tough issues and understanding the community so you can address those concerns is so paramount. And having someone that's going to stand by and actually deliver. And when they do mess up, because part of what I would say to communities is, look, we're human. It's not that we're never going to have a fault or screw up. It's how do we react when we do that. That is where you can judge who and what we are as people, and therefore extrapolate that to the development we're trying to propose.
Yeah, and I think having the community stand with you, so you're not just by yourself. You have that political support. You have, you know, support of community leaders that are kind of, you know, saying, we believe in what you're going to do here.
One of the things that's similar when you're talking about the different sides of development on Long Island to the national conversation, we have a very, very polarized national environment right now, and that also leads to a lot of fighting back and forth. We found anytime I write about a new development, our paper gets a lot of comments that it's going to look like Queens. I didn't move to Long Island to live in Queens. I would have lived in Queens if I wanted to live in Queens. Queens, 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 Queens. So the two things that I dread most is hearing the term fake news and Queens. Now,
Could you put that in a sentence?
Yes. I was born in the Bronx, but I grew up in Queens. Queens is one of the most prosperous places. I think the property values have gone up in Queens maybe 3 times in the last 20 years. They speak more languages in Queens than any place else in the world. It's the most diverse area of the country. There's all kinds of different people there. Everybody seems to get along. There's all different kinds of housing in Queens. If I showed you a picture of a neighborhood and I said, is this Long Island and Queens, you probably wouldn't know, because there's a lot of single-family neighborhoods in Queens and a lot of multifamily. But anytime there's a multifamily project that has to get built, and sometimes it's not even a multifamily project. I just wrote about a quick check that's opening in Comac, and the comment was, it's going to look like Queens. Well, show me a quick check in Queens, because they don't have any.
I can show you a bunch in Dallas, and they're pretty cool.
Yeah, well, they're great. They're great, and they've been very successful here on Long Island. But that's the kind of comments we got. You have two people, two groups that are diametrically opposed. And I don't know if you're ever going to convince one or the other that the other one is right. And that's a struggle that's ongoing.
Well, it seems that the minority that are vigorously against it, that's not who you're going after to change. You're going after the people that are the undecideds. And I remember with the Avalon project, I was helping, so I was on the town Economic Development Corporation, and I was trying to help this project move forward. So it was a Facebook-driven thing at the time, and if they were saying the sewer was going to get exploded, I got a letter from the sewer district and a link, posted it so everybody could see it, and then over time, you became a credible voice that was drowning out the people that were, against it. But what you said is right on. If you ask the community what are they looking for, because what they were telling us, there was no grocery store in all of Huntington Station, and there was no bank. There was no banks there, financial investment or any of that stuff. And we told them, we said, look, the retail is not going to come and then hope the disposable income follows. Right. You got to get the disposable income there, and then the retail will change. But
let me ask my colleague here, who's probably going to key my car by the end of the afternoon, to basically defend his life. You made the point that we've all become news producers as well as news consumers. So if that's the case, and social media is clearly the medium by which I'm going to communicate with my peers and my business associates, what's the purpose of journalism?
Well, so the people that have Facebook pages, Plainview Moms is one. Very good page, by the way, and no disrespect to Plainview. There's a couple of Facebook groups that talk about a very, very narrow thing, okay, very, very narrow topic. You need journalism because, journalism isn't just about what's happening in Plainview. So you need journalism because you have to find out what's happening in other places. You also need journalism as a check on the government. We're often called the fourth estate or the fourth branch of government. A free press is vital to a democracy. There's a lot of things that nobody here would have known about if it wasn't for journalists and if it wasn't for reporters. Unfortunately, because of shrinking newsrooms and the stress on the financial state of journalism, there's going to be a lot less of that. And that really is bad, and it's very, very bad for everyone. So, but you need journalism, you need a free press, and you need trusted sources where the person who's writing that you follow or the outlet that you follow is right most of the time. And again, accuracy equals credibility, all the way down to the Oxford comma, or all the way down to getting the numbers right, the spelling right. It seems like a very innocent or trivial thing, but accuracy is so important when it comes to finding what a credible source is.
I think trusted sources is really important, and it goes back to what you said, David. You were posting those letters inside of those groups, and I think, in my experience, wading into a Plainview Moms group with a differing opinion is
daunting.
a brave task. And
by the way, it's a great group.
So I'm not in it. I think it's a closed group, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
Well,
I can get it.
But let me just say, so what you're saying is absolutely correct. And delving into that, but you can turn them, because with the Avalon thing, they let me in, and I'm not sure why they let me in initially, but by sourcing everything and having a level head and not losing my temper at all on it, right? We're going through, I got kicked out.
Right.
But the rest of the members forced them to put me back in. Well, they wanted to hear, so it made that turn, and now Avalon is there.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think there's two things that I went to a dinner one night, and Peter King was speaking, and he said only 13% of the people vote. So 6% are right wing, 6% are left wing, you can count on that. You have to sway the 1%, right? So Plainview moms is probably 12%,
Right.
you know, whatever the negative opinion of the day is, and 1%. Swaying Plainview moms doesn't help you. You know, I think a lot of times they're not coming out and speaking on behalf of a project or not speaking, but having a trusted source like that letter or your news article, if it benefits me as a developer, your story, which you as a trusted source benefits me, I should be sharing that trusted source into that community. Now, you can pay Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever to target specific communities or specific demographics. So instead of wading into the small group and trying to turn a few, you can just say all of Plainview needs to learn that quick checks are good.
Right.
You know, and you can do that with the technology that's there. And for me, as a developer, to come in and say, quick checks are good, people are going to say, well, you're greedy and you love ruining my neighborhood, even if I live in that neighborhood.
Right.
But if David says it and I share it, then he's a trusted source, and I'm just pushing it into the neighborhood.
You know, I do find that if everybody's dealing with the same set of facts, the resultant opinions tend to be much closer, even when you're dealing with the people.
Yes and no.
All right, go ahead.
I just have another quick anecdote. I did a story recently, I don't know if anybody saw it, about the Oceanside Jewish Center. The Oceanside Jewish Center had to sell part of their property to survive, and they sold it to a developer who has some plans to redevelop, I don't know, about 2 3/4 acres of their 4-acre plot. They're going to downsize the Jewish Center, and this developer is going to come in and build something. Now, he thought this was very unique. He says, I'm going to give the community 5 different plans, and they can choose the plan. And I know all of these plans are financially viable. Well, he made a couple of mistakes.
By the way, is this developer from the island? Does he know the island?
Yes, yes.
All right, so that's surprising.
But he was in over his head. He's a former house flipper who had a relationship with the Jewish Center, and now all of a sudden he's building a 120-unit apartment building, which he's never done before. So, and the choices were very interesting. 120-unit market rate, 120-unit affordable for 62 and over, a medical office building, a self-storage facility, not another self-storage facility, yes, another self-storage facility. And I don't know what the fifth thing was. The mistake he made was giving me the story before he went to the community.
Yeah, that's a mistake.
That's a big mistake. So I wrote the story because I have a story and nobody else had it, so I'm going to write that story. Now, if I was on his payroll, I would say, don't give me this story. You know, go back to the community, talk to the guy from the town of Hempstead, get stuff at least in a row. You don't need the approvals yet, but at least you need to have it out there so that they're not surprised. Well, as soon as the story was published, I was getting calls in my office. I just read your story. How do I stop this? How do I stop this? How do I stop this? This is a disaster. I can't believe it. They're going to destroy Oceanside. We're a quaint little cozy community. Has anybody ever been to Oceanside, by the way? The cozy, quaint community of Oceanside? So, the point of all that is...
Boy, the hate mail you're going to get from...
Well, the day after, first of all, and they were very upset with me for not talking to the neighbors. Why did you write this story without talking to us? Well, we're a business-to-business paper. I'm writing about a development plan. I wasn't ready to go to, house to house and say, hey, how do you like this? Because I already know how they're going to like it. They're not going to like it. So it wasn't my audience. It wasn't something that should be in my story. But 2 days later, somebody emailed me from the group. We already have 1,200 signatures against this, and we have a Facebook page, Stop the Madness. And we really think you should come and talk to us now because we want to give our side of the story. Well, I didn't, because that's a Newsday thing, or a Herald thing. It's not me.
Thing, yeah. So what I say to clients, which is why I asked the question, is this guy from the island, I mean, that is such a
Rookie mistake.
Yeah, it's a rookie mistake. I tell folks who come to the island for the first time, we're the Balkans with shopping malls. We are such a series of parochial communities. So I live in Syosset. I was doing some work out in Southampton with a developer. The attorney is busy briefing me, and then he stops, and then he says, "You're from Up Island, you wouldn't understand this." And I'm processing that, and then I realize, oh, wait a minute, that's a pejorative. If I live to the west of the Shinnecock Canal, I'm a jerk. I couldn't possibly understand the dynamics out here. So we are a really interesting group of 2.7 million iconoclasts, and I think the more sophisticated of the developers understand the complexity. The idea that this guy would willingly go running into a oceanside buzzsaw is, I mean, really?
So here, if I may ask a question to both of you, actually. So as you know, when we talk about trusted sources, we're talking a lot about the media, but then we are sometimes the sources for our own projects, where we all know that we want it to be in a positive light. So, how can folks in the audience put the best foot forward, understanding we can't, just show all the math, but we need to show enough. And we certainly don't want to be in a position where I get a call from Gary or David saying, "Brandon, you told me X, and honestly, you were so off here, I can't trust you anymore."
Okay.
How do we balance the need to serve our...
First of all, one of the things I wanted to say today is the importance of good PR people. My job depends on good PR.
You know any?
My job...
You can't make a living.
Meanwhile, you're the only one with a tie, and the only one that can afford a razor up on the whole panel. So, don't start. But seriously, I always tell people, especially when they're going to do development, you need at least a PR person, maybe even a community organizer. You have to start with that. They're going to steer you in the right direction. They're going to make sure they get boots on the ground, and they're going to make sure that you're talking to the right people and that the right people are on board. My dad, God bless him, was a salesman his whole life. And he taught me the best way to sell is to make it sound like it's the customer's idea. That's what you have to do. You have to present something that says, hey, this downtown is looking kind of shabby. Look at all the vacant stores. Wouldn't it be good if there were more stores and more people coming in, and maybe it could broaden the tax base, and maybe you could have nicer stores, or maybe you could have a couple of nicer places to live? Don't you think that would be good? Yeah, that would be good. That would be good. Okay, so you start that conversation, you prime the pump, and guys like this, professionals like this, and I'm not just, kissing up because he might schmear me later, are so important. So important. And they're not only important for developers and to get developments off the ground on the right foot, they're important to journalism in general now. Again, we harken back to that shrinking newsroom. We have 2 reporters left at the Long Island Business News. We have 2 reporters to cover 3 million people. We're the 10th largest market in America, okay? My company, we're owned by a giant hedge fund, and the company has papers all over. In fact, they're buying Gannett. I don't know if you saw that, but they're going to be buying Gannett, USA Today. They're going to have hundreds more papers. They have a paper in Rochester, a business paper, where they have 7 reporters and 4 editors.
In a market how big?
Way smaller than this.
Exactly.
And I didn't get, but that's just the way it is. So we have to rely on people like Gary all the time. They're so important to us. I'm just one person. I can't get around to everybody. I don't know who's Zooming who.
Right.
I don't know. So a PR guy is really, really important. And I would recommend that first, right off the bat. If you don't have a good one, get one.
And it's really just to make it clear with everyone, it's what Gary's job is not to get out to the public and sort of trick them early. So
I feel like I'm at my own Shiva.
But it's to communicate the facts. Really, you just want to communicate the facts, right? You want the truth, the facts, and you want to stand behind that. If you guys get something approved that's not going to be successful, you lost money. So you don't want something to go forward that's not going to work out.
Right.
So it's...
But I think that's also part of the root issue, because we have to understand the human condition. I use this equation, or this sort of comparison, and it's like buying a car. Whenever you leave after you've purchased a car, Like, how much did I leave on the table? I could have gotten another 500 off or whatever. What you know is you may or may not have gotten a good deal, but you know for sure the dealership did not get a bad deal. They know at this point they just don't go any lower.
Right.
And as a community, that's how the developer is you know a developer's not, at least a developer that's worth their salt, is not going to move forward with something that doesn't make money, but maybe they're making too much money. Or maybe they are taking advantage. I mean, there are examples where developments have not gone the way that they should have. But as a community, you don't know where that line in the sand is, and that's why building the trust that I think Christopher and I both talked about is so important. You can never completely erase that line and have complete transparency, but you can get to a point where there's trust built and enough education that the community can say, oh, if I want those stores, and I do want them, I now understand we need 3 or 4 stories of residential above, and we need a train station, and whatever it might be.
Coin of the realm in any development on the island is trust. Absolute trust. And
Also, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, just briefly. You said it's great if we can all operate from the same set of facts. Unfortunately, there are facts, and there are alternative facts, as you've heard somebody once say. And that's so back to the Oceanside thing. I got that email that we already have 1,200 signatures, and this is why we have to stop this project. If this project goes through, our property values will plummet. The word plummet was used. Will plummet. Not only that, we're all going to be paying higher taxes to pay for the increases in services that this development's going to need. Okay, 2 wrong things right off the bat. But those are their set of facts. And they're reaching out to these people who live in the neighborhood, and they're saying, we have to stop this because this is a disaster. Well, those facts are wrong. You have numbers that show that housing within a half a mile, this is a different thing, but within a half a mile of mass transit, values of housing have gone up appreciably, and even with multifamily there. So that's gone, and with the tax base being broader, you're not going to pay more in taxes. You may even pay less in taxes because you have another rateable coming in.
Right.
So it's about a set of facts that's,
And it's also how, the development community has to learn how to present the facts. Because even, I've had conversations with the Suffolk County IDA and with the Nassau County IDA, and I remember talking with Joanne Manieri. We were at some sort of function, and there was a big banner that the Suffolk County IDA put out, $10 million to whatever. And I was like, that's the worst poster you could possibly have up. And she was like, what are you talking about? I said, your first line should be, we fostered $100 million of private investment, and we gave $10 million worth of benefit. Because that's the truth. Now, both of those banners are factually correct. Just the presentation and knowing what you're dealing with, because every time anything that IDA is out in any of the media, everybody's, how could we be giving this company that's making billions of dollars more, right? They seem to think, like AOC thought there was a $3 billion suitcase of money someplace that she could spend on feeding the poor. So we have to watch on how we're presenting ourselves as well. So Chris, let me ask you, so you're starting to go into a new community, and you've been branching out. You're in Lindenhurst now, right? You did the Port Jeff thing. You're off the island. But here on the island, you're going into an area, and people are like, oh, there's those Tritech guys that ruined Patchogue and ruined this. Let's say no to Tritech for XYZ town. And now you're starting to get a swell up of misinformation. I shouldn't say that either, right? Alternative facts that are coming up, and what do you do?
Well, one of the good things in working for Tritech is that actually we get invited into those communities first.
Okay.
So we tend not to go to places where we aren't wanted. We go to places that we are. That being said, we do encounter a lot of those same, you're going to ruin the schools, you're going to turn it into Queens, you're going to, make this, there's just going to be, what happens when we have a birthday party? What kind of question is what happens when we have a birthday party?
Right.
Where do people park at your house when you have a birthday party, But inevitably, what happens when we have a birthday party always comes up.
I never heard that.
I guess, so what we do with that, when we do get invited, we say, who do we need to speak to in your community? Who are those people that are going to tell us who you are? Because we're not going to build something like when we built New Village in Patchogue. If you look, our first building there was 31 West Main Street. And that building was built in 1897. The top of the building was destroyed in a fire in the 1960s. And it was replaced with a fiberglass top. So it looked horrific. But the building was cool because all the brickwork was original from 1897, and a lot of the elements in the building were the same. So when we went there, we rebuilt that building in 2009, replaced the cornices. Now we got from the original photos, we replicated that original cornice and brought the building back to what it previously was. On the corner of that same development was a school and a library, sorry, that was originally built in 1907 by Andrew Carnegie. They decided, it was not a historic landmark, but the community decided that they would like to keep it. So we drove it a quarter mile down the road in the middle of the night on 16 self-leveling wheels, and that is now it's an annex to the Patchogue Medford Library and a teen center, and it's been restored to what it previously looked like. So we learn to care about what they care about and play to those items, whether it be big things like driving a library down the street. But in that same project, there was a plaque in the sidewalk for this guy who, it was actually for his dog, that this Duke the dog was always sit on watch on the four corners, and there was a plaque that this was like the community's friend.
Right.
We saved that plaque for I guess about 3 years until we could reinstall it back in that sidewalk. And just said, it's little things and big things. Like in our shipyard project in Port Jeff, the ceiling grid for our common area is the same design as the deck of the last ship built in Port Jefferson Harbor. So we try to take the things that they take pride in, the things that they tell us when they tell us who they are, and then bring them into the project.
So by the way, all the guys from Bethpage Federal Credit, they all shifted in their seats. They're going to hit you with a copyright infringement for stealing their brand marketing slogan.
So Gary, you have a client that's not so altruistic as TriTech, and obviously what you're saying is reaching deep into the community, and I can see why you guys have been as successful as you've been over the years. So Gary, you have a client that doesn't have that warm side to them. Pop up a Facebook page, say no to XYZ development, and there's now local, papers are pushing against it. What's your go-to thing? How do you deal with that?
Well, I'm going to default to have you been honest and open with the community. It's a baseline. The neat thing about working for a family business is that we do one of these when we are talking to a potential client. And if we think the client is going to be opaque, that's a good word in this discussion, is going to be opaque in terms of communicating the facts, and that's the facts, we don't necessarily take a client that we think is going to set us up for failure or to lose our reputation with various communities. I have to tell you, and it's an interesting note in terms of the business folks in this room. So as a corporate culture and as a policy, we don't take government accounts. We could, but we don't. We don't do political campaigns. We've got the talent to do it. We don't. It's a matter of choice. So after 9/11, I don't know, I think we had a meeting, maybe it was 3 months after 9/11, and everybody's business in New York is down 20%. Everybody's business. And we're at 54th and 6th, that's a sort of a high rent district. And I sit on the executive board of the company, and I'm sitting next to Rubenstein, and I said to him on our Tuesday morning meeting, do you want to revisit that unilateral embargo on government accounts? Because we could have picked up a lot of business and dealt with that 20% VIG. And to make a point to everybody in the room, he gets inside my personal space and he goes, "No." I have to tell you, it's one of the reasons why I'm still there, is because of the level of integrity. I mean, I don't think I would have had that amount of discipline to take the hit every month for as long as it takes and not violate that line in the sand. So in answer to your question is, it's not a function of, from my perspective, whether or not your client is altruistic. It's good if they are, and that's really impressive what you did. In fact, beyond impressive. But if the integrity of the project, if the ethics of the client is going to be less than straight, this is a recipe for disaster. And that's where I'm at.
And I can say this because having both been the developer and then having, developers as clients, there are plenty of folks who, they're just in a business. It's neutral. They're looking to do good stuff, but they may not be, or generally almost or rarely as altruistic as you might see in TriTech. So they're wondering, why do I have to spend the money to do this other outreach? And what it really comes down to is then it's a business decision. And if you are going to spend a little more money up front to take what might be a 5-year period and make it a 2-year period, to take what might be a nominal set of entitlements to make it a great set of entitlements, that's an ROI. And I liken that to, I can build you a house cheaper and faster and get you in there almost immediately, just forego building, any foundation.
Right.
But that foundation is going to bring you a lot more value, and in fact might avoid a literal house of cards.
Mm-hmm. So I find now that when, as myself as a broker, I've been do a lot of land development, so in the same boat as the developer, we're both tied into the success of that project. If it's something that we think is going to be at all controversial, we put up a Facebook page immediately. Mm-hmm. And the reason why we do is we want there to be an acknowledged destination for information, not just the say no to whatever Facebook page. So I'll post, or have, some in my office, they'll post, they'll, credit and source the information that it's coming from, and we find that things go through much more smoothly that way.
You have somebody with a mic who wants to ask a question.
Okay. So I'd like to thank all of you here today. We know it was a big topic, and we're going to take questions if anybody has any questions.
This room has
There's one
no
there.
questions. Cool.
Why does everyone say I know it? Okay. First of all, thank you. Wonderful. David, you do a great job, and to the panel, we appreciate it. It's really a question for Gary and Chris in terms of an example. Serial wire, what happened?
It's your neighborhood.
Well, I know for a fact that there are attorneys who have homes in Quogue as a result of that. My take, there had been a deal multiple times to go forward. Personalities, miscues, miscalculations. It's interesting that the community was weaponized and then turned on those who weaponized them, probably much to the surprise of those who handed them the weapons in the first place. I look forward to reading the novel.
Just to build on that, he didn't want to mention any names, but I will. Simon, who owned all the malls, and you probably know the backstory, they're the ones that funded the opposition to the Taubman Mall in Syosset. It was a clear case of antitrust. The problem is, Taubman also does antitrust things in other parts of the country, so they didn't want to go that route. But Simon also, which people may not know, also funded the anti-mega mall at Elmont. It's a group called Elmont Against the Mega Mall. Simon was the one that put the money up for that, I think more than $750,000, to oppose the retail portion of that plan, because that's what they do. So it didn't only happen in Syosset, but it also happened in Elmont.
You know, another mistake they did is you don't knock down the ugly building and clean up the environmental before you get the approvals. Because right now you've got trees growing, there's grass growing, so that's another mistake. There was a question from a gentleman with the red tie back there.
Drinking the coffee.
Drinking the coffee, yes.
Hi, gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. It's been very informative. For anyone who's ever been the subject of a news article, I think they would recognize that sometimes even with the best of intentions, articles get things wrong, especially in the first pass of something being published. So for our developers and for our people who are making news and discover that things are inaccurate, how does that person go about ethically but effectively changing the story, correcting those inaccuracies, and making sure that the accurate thing gets out?
Whose question is that, me?
I think you should answer that question.
We do get that from time to time. We take very accurate notes, and sometimes we take digital recordings of our interviews. So if you said you didn't say something, I could play it back to you and say, hey, you did say something. But again, this goes back to having somebody on the call with you, especially if it's a big deal, that represents your interest, a guy like Gary. Any of the interviews I do with his clients, he's on the phone. And he lets the client know, everything's on the record from here on in until you say it's off the record. And it's also about relationships. I could give a brief example, if you don't mind.
Please.
Okay. So I was doing a story, and I was talking to a client of Gary's on the phone, and the client blurted out something he didn't want to tell me, or he didn't think he did it prematurely, and I had a very, very big story, Gary, because we have a good relationship, asked me, you can't write about that yet. You got to hold it. We'll give you the exclusive in a few days. It's just not ready yet. Please don't write about it. And because I'm not a tabloid reporter, and we have to do something called beat maintenance, which means I have to take care of the people that I write about, because sometimes it'll come back to kill you. Anyway, long story short, I got beat on the story. Another news outlet reported on the story. They got it from another source.
And by the way, I'm still bleeding as a result of that.
No, and he felt very bad.
Because we had created a professional understanding of, okay, he said something he shouldn't have. You'll hold it. You'll got the exclusive, and there's a second conduit that went.
Right. They went to the city. They went to the government agency to get the story, and they beat me by 20 minutes on the story. I had the story already, but I was holding it. So things like that happen, but I feel like you still need good PR people to help you when you're talking to reporters.
Your question, though, was more about what happens afterwards, though, right? So how would,
So it depends on how egregious it is. I mean, if you're put in a position where suddenly you discover you've lost a deal or there's libel, and by the way, if I had a nickel for every client who said, my God, I'm going to sue them, those bastards, they were go ahead, take your shot. They got corporate lawyers waiting for you. So if you think you've been terribly burned by a reporter, and you're important to that reporter's beat, you can have a separate conversation saying, here's how I think you have journalistically erred. Can't be a function of those gray areas, and there are an awful lot of gray areas in terms of how people report. If they screwed up the facts, you can have a serious conversation with that reporter. If they refuse to acknowledge that they screwed up the facts, you can insist on having a meeting with the editor. But you're beginning to ratchet it up. Everybody's beginning to go to DEFCON 1. I've yet to meet an editor who throws a reporter under the bus. So you're going to have dead to rights the fact that that story was inaccurate, as opposed to they mischaracterized the nature of the project. That's a gray area you can drive a truck through.
And from a personal perspective, it comes back to, your reputation is the most important thing you have, because sometimes what they write is true. Sometimes it's without context or with a context that you remember it somewhat differently. But an objective friend says, you did kind of say that It wasn't the brightest thing, but look, you have 20, 30, 40 years of being an upstanding citizen, of doing things the right way, and then it's up to us to own it. It's not us to blame the press or blame our PR person for the truth of something that may have happened 10, 15 years ago to come on out. Face it, if indeed you have that type of reputation and are indeed a sterling member of the community, let that lead. Say, you know what, that was pretty dumb of me. I really screwed up. I've learned from it, or I'm learning from it now. But we got to take responsibility sometimes as the content, especially if the content is correct, understanding the same situation can be looked at differently within different contexts and different perspectives.
Beat maintenance, by the way, is a little like the mob. So you're gonna tell me something, right? And then I write the story, and you call me up and go, Dave, I know I said that, but I wanted you to say this, whatever. I'll change that. You know why? Because I want to be able to talk to you again, and I'm expecting that you're going to drop a dime on somebody else, or you're going to give me a tip that's going to lead to another story. And that's all part of beat maintenance. I don't want to make you an enemy. And if it doesn't really affect the story itself, then it doesn't really matter to me. So I'm going to help you out. But that's me. That's not all reporters. And that's why I said I'm not a tabloid reporter. Some guys will just go for the throat, and that's it.
There are some reporters who view each and every one of you as a potential ticket to a Pulitzer.
Listen, and that's why Dave is still here, is because of those relationships. I mean, you and I had that recently, that an article that he wrote on the school districts being, land use authorities. And I thought I was very careful, but in the middle of the night, I was like, holy crap, what did I say? But I called him up, we went over it and stayed on the facts. I mean, everything was factual, and when he calls, do you take his call?
School districts love me, by the way.
All right. And candidly, there was one business reporter who consistently got the facts wrong to the point of where I would say to the client, we're not pitching that reporter ever again. Well, then we won't get in the paper. We cannot afford to have another story that is factually incorrect, that it will live forever online. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Can't afford it.
Right. Any other questions from the back there?
We have time for one last question.
I was chicken.
Chris Damianos has a question.
Who?
I'm getting you for the tow truck joke.
Hold on, Chris. Everybody can hear you.
Mike's coming.
Thanks, Dave. I didn't have a question, but now I do. Why did you ask me if I have a question? I guess this question, is for Dave Winzelberg, since you're the press guy up there. You mentioned before about how Newsday, under pressure from P.C. Richards, put in next to the obituary the article.
I didn't say under pressure from PC.
I did.
I just said that's what happened.
That was my perception. But how does this work now? And what, the press is under a lot of pressure, obviously, to sell papers. They're not selling ads, so they got to sell papers. How much pressure is on the media to print something that's may not be factually correct, but is going to sell papers?
Yeah, I don't see that happening with trusted sources. Again, we're going back to trusted sources. I don't see that happening so much with trusted sources. Yes, and reporters are under a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of competition to be first, to also be sensational. And tabloids, they're gonna do what they do. We don't do that. We're a business-to-business paper, so we're a little less controversial. It's very important to me to have a story first, though. And it's sort of in my DNA. Newsday has 300 reporters. We have 2. They're in every town meeting. They're everywhere. So when I can scoop them, which I do regularly, thank you very much, it's a feather in my cap, and it makes me feel really, really good. But I hope that the pieces I do are factual. I try to be fair, and I try to be factual. I think the way that I get over is to be first. And that's not necessarily being inaccurate, it's just being first.
Right. No, I didn't mean you, because you have written some great articles on our organization. I thank you for that. I really wasn't talking about the business news. The business news is one of the few outlets that you actually get a fair shake in. I was really talking about some of the other medias that are out there.
Yeah, I'm sure it happens.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you to our panelists.